And let's see what happens when we do. If I click on the right icon, hooray. We're to remember them that have gone on before us, and we're to follow their good examples. So that's our number one reason. There are a lot of other really good reasons too. So we talked about that. And then we talked about what is a Baptist? And Baptist is not defined by the name. You don't have to have the name Baptist. One of our supporting churches when we were missionaries was Boones Creek Bible Church in Boones Creek, Tennessee. And they're a Baptist church. They just don't have the word Baptist in the name of the church. Baptists are defined by the Baptist distinctives, and we went through those real quickly with you last week. We talked about three main theories of Baptist origins: the successionist theory, the spiritual kinship theory, and the English separatist theory. Now, we can demonstrate a succession from the English separatists in the early 1600s on down to today. Baptists today are descended from them. Before that, things get a little murkier, and there really isn't solid ground to say we can see a historically provable succession, although we admit that the normal way to start churches is for churches to start churches, okay? And we also know that there were other groups not labeled as Baptists that came before the Baptists that had many of the same characteristics as we do. The problem there, part of it at least, is that most of the information we have about many of these groups comes from their enemies. And we saw last week that information is oftentimes either false or misleading. For instance, it was said about the Anabaptists that they were polygamists. Well, where did they get the idea they were polygamists? Imagine, if you will, there's a warrant out for the arrest of your pastor. And if he's arrested, he's going to be in prison, he'll probably be tortured, he may be killed. What's he supposed to do? Well, he should head for the tall timber and get away, okay? But what's going to happen to his family? Well, there's a kind family in the church that will take in his wife and his kids, okay? So there you are. The Anabaptists are polygamists. Of course, it's totally false, but that's where they get it. And I mentioned several groups by name. Some of these go back into as early as 300 or so AD. The Waldensians go at least back to the year 1000 and possibly even before that. The Anabaptists really, they come up above ground, and we really start seeing them right at the beginning of the Reformation, which is the early 1500s. Okay, and we were talking about them. There were several varieties of them. Mainly, somebody got labeled an Anabaptist if it's somebody you didn't like. Okay, if you're in the state church and you don't like them, they're an Anabaptist, even though some of them didn't even believe in baptism. And we mentioned last week Michael Servetus, who was burned at the stake. He did not believe in the Trinity. The Chiliasts, and we mentioned Melchior Hoffman, who died in prison, social revolutionaries, Thomas Mincer. The nobles really did some bad things to the peasants, the poor farmers. They'd confiscate 20% of their crops. When the peasant died, the Lord got to come in and have his pick of whatever that was in the man's estate, and then his family got whatever was left over. That's the kind of stuff that happened, and you can understand why the peasants would be upset by that. And Thomas Mincer led this revolt, and he ended up getting executed. And a lot of peasants lost their lives, perhaps as many as 100,000. Luther wrote a pamphlet called Against the Murderous and Thieving Hordes of the Peasants, in which he said that the nobles should slaughter them. Well, the nobles were going to slaughter them no matter what Luther said. It didn't matter. But Luther wanted to make sure that the nobles knew he was on their side, because he looked to them for their protection. What happened to Jan Hus? What happened to Wycliffe? They didn't have state protection, and particularly Hus. Wycliffe died a natural death, but a few years later they dug up his bones and burned them and dumped them in the river. The mystics we mentioned. Now I want to talk about the biblical Anabaptists. These are the ones that are in faith and practice the closest to us. And these were well educated, and they were able to explain what they believed. First one I'll mention is Menno Simons. He was a Dutch Anabaptist, and his name is attached to the Mennonites today. If you want to know what he looked like, that's what he looked like. Things were really bad in Holland when he came to the fore and really rescued the Anabaptists there from disaster because of some bad things they were associated with. They were social revolutionaries, different set of social revolutionaries. But he's one of the few of these early Anabaptist leaders that died a natural death. The authorities were chasing him all the time, and it was the death penalty if you harbored him. And there were people who were executed because they wouldn't tell the authorities where Menno Simons was. But he died a natural death. Then Balthasar Hubmaier, he wrote a powerful pamphlet called On Heretics and Those Who Burn Them, in which he said those who burn heretics are the worst heretics of all. And of course, he was right. Very interesting man. He was with Ulrich Zwingli, one of the early Protestant leaders in Switzerland. And when they came to a disagreement, they tortured Hubmaier to get him to recant his beliefs. And finally, he did recant. And then when he got up to read the recantation in front of the church, he recanted his recantation. And for that, he was exiled. He ended up later on in Vienna, where the Roman Catholics tried him as a heretic and burned him at the stake. 3 days later, they drowned his wife in the Danube River. And I've seen the spot where he was executed. My opinion, Hubmaier was the very best of them, but there were a lot of really great men too. Conrad Grebel died a natural death in an epidemic, but he was really young. And some of the others we can mention, George Blaurock, Felix Montz, Michael Sattler, they were all executed. And not all of them by the Roman Catholics, some of them by the Protestants too. They were either drowned or burned at the stake. Michael Sattler's wife was drowned too. So there's Hubmaier. And I've already mentioned this point. Sadly, the Anabaptists were persecuted by both Protestants and Catholics. Many of the early leaders were burned at the stake or drowned. There were a few minor differences. The major differences between the Baptists and Anabaptists was that, first of all, most Anabaptists were pacifists. Hubmaier was an exception to that one. They did not believe in taking oaths or holding public office. Hubmaier said it's not only possible, but it's desirable for a Christian to hold public office. So he was an exception on that one too. Some Anabaptists did not baptize by immersion. But the Mennonites, the Hutterites, and the Amish are descendants of the biblical Anabaptists. And we got to stop with this particular PowerPoint. And I have a hard time finding my cursor in this mode. Ta-da. Come on. Where'd it go? Okay. Good night. I can't see it on my screen. Yes.
You want me to put it up there and follow you?
Yeah, you could, if that would be any faster. I'd like to know what my next slide is, though. Yeah, well, right. Better than nothing. Okay. We'll start. The next two series of slides are the two longest. The history of the Baptists in the British Isles and the history of the Baptists in America. So we start with the British Isles first. If we could have the next slide. Baptists in England have two separate sources. There are General Baptists and there are Particular Baptists. The General Baptists came from a group of Englishmen who returned to their native land from Holland. And the term general refers to their belief that the atonement of Christ is for all. The Particular Baptists arose from a group of Puritans who believed in the independence of the local church. And these Baptists believe that Christ died in particular for the elect. Now, you will say, oh, these are Calvinists and anti-Calvinists. Actually, the differences between the two are not as big as what you would think. Today, we're more extreme than they were back then. So don't think of one side is bad and the other side is good, or both sides are bad, or whatever. All right. The General Baptists met in Gainsborough, Lincolnshire, this particular group in England. And eventually the group became too large to meet in one place, so they divided. And half of them continued to meet in Gainsborough, and the other half met in a place called Scrooby Manor under the leadership of Elder John Robinson. And then the rest remain in Gainsborough under the leadership of John Smith. Okay? So it's a really exciting story of how they made it to Holland. It's like they hired a ship, the women and the kids got on the ship, and the authorities were ready to arrest the men and put them in jail with the women on the ship sailing for Holland. And God rescued them, and the men did get on the ship, and they did get off to Holland. And the one thing they found in Holland was religious freedom. That's what the Dutch offered them. Robinson's group went to Leiden, and Smith's group went to Amsterdam. So, two different places in Holland. But when they saw the children learn to swear and drink like Dutch children, the Leiden group determined to leave Holland, even though Holland had given them religious liberty. Okay, so this is the Robinson group. They came from Scrooby Manor and came to Leiden. And these brave families, the older ones stayed in Holland because they were too old to undergo a trip and all the hardships that they were going to face like this. But the younger ones took their families and got on a couple of ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. And the Speedwell had so many leaks, they had to turn around and go back to England, and everybody got on the Mayflower. And they landed at Plymouth Rock. So one myth that I want to dispel about the Pilgrims is that they came to America for religious freedom. They did not. They had religious freedom in Holland. They came to America for the same reason that a lot of families send their kids to Christian school or homeschool them. It's because of the bad influence of the Dutch kids on their kids. They wanted to get them away from that bad influence and raise them for the Lord. So, meanwhile, back at the ranch, in Amsterdam in 1612, through contact with the Dutch Baptists, Smith became convinced that baptism is for believers only. And he persuaded his church of this teaching and then baptized them by pouring water on them. Okay? At this point, they held to believers' baptism, but not believers' baptism by immersion. Okay? So, part of the church returned to England under the leadership of Thomas Helwys. Thomas Helwys came to regret the fact that they had left England, and he came to the conviction that it's wrong to run from persecution. Paul ran from persecution. I mean, I don't have a problem with that, but he felt that it was wrong what they had done, so the church wasn't very big in the first place, but he took half the church and returned to England, where he was almost immediately arrested, and he died in Newgate Prison in 1616. This then was the first Baptist church on English soil, although at this point they weren't practicing immersion yet. So, particular Baptists, completely different origin. They arose from independent Puritans who stressed the independence of the local church. And here are some of their early leaders: John Spilsbury, William Kiffin, Henry Jesse, Benjamin Keach, and we'll talk specifically about Kiffin and Keach. Kiffin was a wealthy merchant whose good sense and political connections were a great asset. He knew the king personally. In fact, the king said, "Hey, old buddy, old pal, how about giving me a loan?" I forgot what the amount was. I want 100,000 pounds. And Kiffin knew that if he gave him the loan, the king was never going to pay it back. It was like money I'm saying goodbye to. So he said to the king, I really don't have 100,000 I could lend you right now, but I could give you 50,000 as a gift. And the king thought, wow, that's a good idea. I'll take it as a gift. And well, it was a bargain for Kiffin too, because it was 50% of what he would have been out otherwise. But he was a man of really good sense. He was a good pastor, as well as being this wealthy merchant. Benjamin Keach was the pastor of the Horsley Down Church in Southwark. That name is going to come up again, so kind of bookmark that. Keach, he was the first to introduce hymn singing in his congregation, and the way he did it was very wise. They'd have their long service, typically 2-hour service on Sunday morning, and then he'd say, okay, now you're all dismissed, but if you want to stay around for a singspiration, we're going to have a singspiration after the service. Because during the service, they would only sing metrical versions of the Psalms. They didn't believe in singing hymns. But the young people would stay around and they'd sing hymns after the service. And eventually he introduced this into the regular service, and he still lost some families from his church. Go quickly through a few of the early Baptist writings. Persecution for Religion Judged and Condemned by John Merton. He was a General Baptist, and he wrote that from prison in 1615, and then he died in 26. I don't have a birth date for him. Particular Baptist Confession of Faith in 1644, revised in 1689. This is important because Benjamin Keach's son brought this to America, and it was in a modified form, uses the Philadelphia Confession, which was the first Baptist Confession of Faith in America, and then later in a much edited form it became the New Hampshire Confession, and that's the basis for our church confession. Okay, so we can trace a line of confessions of faith back to that. The child instructor, I'd mentioned, Keach was arrested and pilloried on account of that book. All the copies were confiscated and destroyed, so we don't even know what the book said. But he wrote several other books too, but I thought I'd bring that one up. Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Bunyan was imprisoned for over 12 years in the two longest imprisonments were 6 years each. And all he had to do to get out of prison was say, I promise I won't preach anymore. He was in prison because he was preaching illegally because he wasn't approved of by the state church. And the government said, you go to prison because you're an illegal preacher. And from prison, he wrote a lot of books. Among them was the famous book, The Pilgrim's Progress, which is maybe the greatest piece of prose ever written in the English language. So we are, his fame through his many writings and through his suffering helped bring about the acts of toleration. So what's next? Okay. So the Baptists had big challenges. The government sought to enforce strict Anglicanism or Puritanism, depending on who was in charge. Some radicals, the Fifth Monarchy men. There were a couple of Baptists in that, but then the Baptists got blamed for the whole thing. And it was not a good thing. It was a political revolution, an attempted coup. And the Fifth Monarchy men were put down, and a bunch of them were executed. But now the Baptists were poised for explosive growth, but it didn't happen. Why not? Well, first they were worn out from persecution. Okay, we say the blood of the martyrs is their seed. Remember, that's from Justin Martyr way back when. That's not always true. You can be worn out from persecution. Their leaders they had a tremendous group of leaders in the early Baptist movement. Those leaders were dying, passing off the scene, and the younger leaders just weren't what the older ones were. General Baptists and particular Baptists each had their own special problems. With the General Baptists, it was false teaching. They were given a choice between correct doctrine and unity. If they insisted on correct doctrine, they weren't going to have unity. So they picked unity, and in the end, they didn't get either one. They couldn't have it. Particular Baptist problem was hyper-Calvinism. One particular Baptist preacher boasted that he had preached for over 50 years and never addressed the unconverted. Well, the way he did that was this. All the unsaved sit on this side, all the saved sit on this side. And the pastor would say, you know, if these sinners over here knew what was awaiting them, they would repent right away. But he never talked to them directly. Okay? And believe it or not, he was a successful preacher. He was one of the greatest Hebrew scholars of his day. And he wrote a book, The Body of Divinity, which is still in print and still quoted today. But he was a hyper-Calvinist, and that had a deadening effect on evangelism. And So God wanted to bring revival to the English Baptists, but the Baptists weren't listening. So instead, he brought revival through John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, the Methodists. And we're going to have to stop there because I'm past my time. Okay.
Good, good. My father-in-law has put some of this in a booklet form, and I want you to know that at the end of the series, we'll eventually get these in your hands, so that'll be helpful. So soak in as much as you can. My encouragement is ask questions. If something runs past you, ask questions. Every one of those men that he mentioned tonight has stories, and my mind starts running because I know a little bit. He knows a lot. And anyways, so feel free to ask questions. We will get to meet these men in heaven, and I rejoice in that. And their testimony is sweet, so that's a blessing. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this time together this evening. Thank you for those who have gone before us, fought some significant spiritual battles. Thank you for the love of freedom, the freedom of religion. Thank you for their hatred for the influence of the world on their younger generation. Thank you that when the Pilgrims came, they were desiring to protect their children from bad influence. Lord, help us, even in this day and age, to balance our evangelism and our separation well, and may we honor you. Lord, thank you for the doctrine that we hold. Thank you for those who have, in a sense, worked through it before we even were around so that we could stand on their shoulders. Bless the rest of this week. Again, be with the teens. Give them a great rest of the week in your name. Amen. Good night. You're dismissed.